In this tutorial, we're going to texture map this table by creating a UV map that will have both the tabletop and the leg with separate UV maps. I'll start by applying a new material, and I'll use the Arnold render node, and I'll choose AI standard surface. I'm going to right click and go to the material attribute if it doesn't appear on the right hand side. I'll name it table. And I'm going to add the default checkerboard pattern by going through base, color, and then clicking on the checkerboard pattern at the end of the slider bar for color. Second term down in our render node window is checker. I'll click on it. And now I'll go over and I'll right click in my viewport and I'll hit 6 on the keyboard. And in some capacity you'll see that texture on the tabletop and the legs. Now I need to use planar mapping for the tabletop and then a term automatic mapping for the legs. So let's start with the planar mapping for the tabletop. If I click on it and hit W, I can see the perpendicular vertex emanating from the center of the table and pointing straight out. So whatever vertex that happens to be, that is the map orientation we're looking for. I'll hold down the space bar, I'll go to UVs, planar mapping, and its attribute. And I'll make sure it's set for Y, and then I'll hit apply. Now we have to be sure that the rectangles, black and white, are perfect squares, not these rectangles I see. So I'm going to click on the channel box and I'm going to change where it says projection width and height to the same number. I'm going to make it a little larger than the largest one, which is about 11.5. Maybe I'll put 20. And the number is insignificant because it will be able to be edited in our UV editing window when we bring that up. I'm going to close this out for a moment. I'm going to make sure that I've got the UV editor window on my dock. It appears to be a green box with a checkerboard in it. If you don't see that, you would simply hold Command Shift, and then you would go to UVs at the top of the user interface, and the first choice is UV editor. Now I'm going to click on the UV editor. And if I look inside that, I can zoom back as if I were in my viewport, and I can see where it is in the context of the checkerboard pattern we applied to the tabletop geometry. Now, just as a review, that checkerboard square that you see, that is the area in which when we export the PNG, Photoshop will allow us to build our texture. So everything has to fall within that. Now that I've got the tabletop plotted, I'm going to pull it outside the actual checkerboard, because the nature of Maya is that whenever I texture map any of my geometry, they all would stack up in this checkerboard box. That would mean that all the different texture UVs would be on top of each other. So it makes it a little easier if you start to move these outside as you plot new UVs on different pieces of geometry. Now that I have the tabletop UV map created, I'm going to right click and go back to the object mode. I'll deselect and I'll select one of the legs. Now I want the wood pattern to run vertical. Any kind of seams on wood planks, I want them to run vertical. So I've got to make that arrangement. In order to do so, I'm selecting that piece of geometry. And I'm going to do something that's integral to any texture mapping once you've taken a shape and modeled it out of a basic cube, perhaps, where it no longer is a perfect cube with all the faces equal. What that means is that the UV map that was created for that cube still applies to this, even though it's no longer a cube. To have the UV map I want to generate follow the shape of the newly made geometry, I need to go to Modify and choose Freeze Transforms. Now I'm going to hold down the space bar. I'll go to UVs once again, and this time I'm going to click on the fourth term down, automatic. And if I were to look inside my UV editor now in that checkerboard square, I'll turn off the checkerboard for reference, you'll see there are the exact faces that were generated by that newly edited polygon shape. I'm going to return to my object mode. Now, the tabletop and the legs have to fit inside this square that is defined by our checkerboard. So in order to do that, I need to scale. I'm going to start by scaling the leg. And I'll turn this off for a moment. I'll right click and choose UV shell. I'm going to marquee select all of the elements that comprise the one leg. I'll hit R for scale, and I'll just make them considerably smaller. Now the size is insignificant. You have to determine the size of your UV elements based on how much geometry has to go in here and also the size. So the tabletop is probably larger, so maybe we would want that to be larger inside this area. I'm now going to go to my object mode. I'm going to shift select the tabletop and the leg, and now they both appear in the UV editor. My objective is to get the tabletop from here down to here and make it bigger because it's a larger element of the actual table itself. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose UV shell. I'll click on it. I'll hit W to move it into the square and then R to scale it up. I'm going to make it as large as I can without going outside the parameters of that checkerboard. So as long as it's in there, Photoshop will see both of these UV maps. I'm going to turn off the checkerboard so this is clearer. I'll right click, return to my object mode, and I'll shift select once again the tabletop and the leg. You have to be in your object mode and you have to shift select any elements you want to appear down here so that you can texture map them when you go into Photoshop. We're now ready to export the final UV map that we can open in Photoshop. I'm going to go to the top of the UV editor to image, and at the very last part of the window you'll see UV snapshot. I'll click on it. I'll browse and put it in the appropriate folder. I'll give it a name, call it Table Skin, and I'll hit save. And I want to make sure that the image format is pink, so I get an alpha channel with just a line reference, and I'm making the table size 1080 by 1080. I'll hit apply and close. Now that we've generated this UV map, we can open it in Photoshop, and there we can do our texture. Now that we're in Photoshop, I've opened up my ping with the UV maps on it, and I've chosen a texture. I'm going to copy and paste the wood panels into the UV map. I'll go to Select All or hit Command A, Command C to copy, and I'll click on the UV map and hit Command V to paste. The first thing I'll want to do with this is to name layer 1 UVs, and then I'm going to lock it down by clicking on the lock at the far end of the layer window where it says lock. I'll click on the padlock, and that assures me that I won't accidentally paint or move those reference lines. If we were to move that layer in Photoshop, the map would not line up with the geometry. Now that I've got the UV map and the texture I want, I'm going to start to edit the texture so that I can make it appear to be a table. So I'm going to start by selecting the texture. I'll hit Command T, and I'm just going to edit this a little bit, change the scale, and put it into position. Now, you can see that the texture is kind of overlapping a little bit where the leg is. But that's not going to be a problem because I want to copy this and then rotate it 90 degrees so I can put it where the leg is. So what I'll probably do is simply get my mark key, and I'll select the piece I might want to use for the leg, and I'm going to copy that to its own layer. So I could hit Command C, Command V, or I could simply hit Command J. And now I have a section of that. If I were to pull it down, you can see what I actually cut out, and it's on a separate layer. If you wanted to, you could start to name some of these layers in case you need to come back and re-edit. And now that I've got the leg, I'm going to rotate it. I'll hit Command T, right-click, choose Rotate 90 degrees clockwise, and I'll put that over into position. And I'm dragging it down so that it's just above the red UV map for the leg. This down here, anything outside these UV maps applies to nothing. There's no geometry, so anything within it will show on our geometry. So simply because my leg wood texture is not up in the area of the table, even though it overlaps with the layer itself, it's insignificant. I'm going to save this now as a PSD, and now we're ready to go back into Maya to apply our texture. Back in Maya, I'm going to select the tabletop, right-click, and choose Material Attribute. And if I need to, I can click on the triangles here to navigate to the AI surface. It's important to break the connection with the checkerboard reference because sometimes there's a conflict with the texture you might add to this that we created in Photoshop and then this placeholder checkerboard. So I'm going to right-click directly over the word color and choose Break Connection. Now, just as we applied the checkerboard reference, I'm going to go to the checkerboard at the end of the slider bar for base color. I'll click on it. And this time we're going to go to File. And now we can navigate out to our texture and we can apply the texture we just made. And you can see now that the texture is on the tabletop and the one leg. Now I'm going to get rid of the legs that don't have the texture applied. Rather than do all these separately, now that I have one that's exactly what I want, I'll delete the others and replace them with the one that's got the texture. This is a lot of the workflow for Maya is based on creating one element, if you need many, texturing it, and then replicating. We could do this with our chair if we wanted to. I'll hit Command D to duplicate with the leg selected. I'll place it where I want. I can Shift select the first one, and with both selected I can hit Command D and I'll drag them back over to the other side. So if I was to return to my perspective view now, my table has the same leg all the way around. Now I want to point out the red that you see here. If you recall, I made the UV reference map in Photoshop red instead of default kind of a gray. And I forgot to turn it off. And I don't want it on the texture. So I'm going to go back to Photoshop and I'm going to go to my file. And all I need to do is turn off the UV editor map. And it's important that you save that change, otherwise Maya can't read the change we've made. So I'll hit Command S to save. I'll return to Maya. And if I needed to, I could right click and go to Material Attribute. I'm going to click on the now black line box with the triangle in it where we applied our texture. I'll click on it and then I'm going to click on Reload. And now you can see that my texture is on minus the UV map. It's important that you go and click on Reload because sometimes Maya will show you a false positive. You won't see it here. And then you'll render and your render will have that red reference UV line. So it's important that you actually click on Reload. And that's pretty much how you would texture map your table.